Welcome to another episode of the Industrial Insights podcast. I have as my guest today, David Hickey of Hickey Associates, who is a great partner for our team and for our firm and helps our clients with economic incentives amongst other additional services. And David's been gracious enough to walk us through part of what the process looks like for clients that are curious and trying to walk the path of negotiating incentives and how to set it up properly and strategically. And then we have a couple other reports that David's firm puts out that we can walk through. So David, welcome to the show. I appreciate you being here.
Justin, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be on your podcast.
Yeah, incentives. We brokers know of them. We know enough to wield them, but we don't walk the path on it. And we hear all sorts of feedback from clients on one hand that have an idea of what is possible and how to do it. That usually is like, go get the building first and then go talk about incentives because you then have a building. And then talking with you about strategy of like having multiple groups jockeying for incentives and having that help leverage a client's position. So maybe you can help walk us through kind of the mindset that clients should have when they're thinking of incentives and how to set the table.
Yeah. Oh, great. Thank you. And, as we work with our clients and we work alongside partners and as we drive forward, and there are so many factors that come into the ultimate site decision. Real estate, of course, being one of those. But as you look through of labor and operations and supply chain logistics, business climate, right? All of these different factors that come into play, and even more, I'd say, and you notice some of the reports is the power and utility side is as important and as front and center as ever before. But one of those factors as well, and should be considered and evaluated, and really any, as we look at real estate and location decisions, it's a business decision. And so, really, when you look at incentives, it's a way to help, be a part and perhaps strengthen the deal, strengthen the business case, develop that partnership with whatever the other entities might be. If it's, from the federal level, the state, provincial, the county, the city, the regional organizations, the utility as well, and certainly expand on that also. And, incentives are never going to make a bad location a good location. And many people have heard that before. And there are reasons that certain incentives are in place and why they're driven. But what they really can provide is that partnership again, and I'll use that word a few times, I'm sure, to really make sure that it is a project that is going to go forward and it's going to be great for the community. It's going to be great for the, the constituency and around there, the jobs and the investment and the tax revenues, everything to build out. And then also to help the business case go forward. Shouldn't be driven on the business case. It should be among all of the different factors that are in place, but certainly considered on it and the ways that they can be utilized, whether it's a tax abatement, it's a tax exemption, it's a direct cash grant, a long-term or forgivable loan or rate reduction, all that's on the potentially on the table to really, again, help that, help move that project forward, make that investment in the future. And from the community perspective and the economic developer is, to help ensure that it's a project that they're excited about, that they can be a partner for and really help drive forward and not to a year or 2 years ahead, but, really as a long-term partnership and commitment to that site and to that location.
You must hear all sorts of hilarious, unrealistic expectations from clients sometimes as like things that are just normal for you and your business. So like one for brokers is like, how are we going? Like we need to look at the existing building and what we're going to do with it before we move to a new one. And the client saying like, don't worry, I have a great relationship with my landlord. He'll totally let me out of the lease if we need to. And that's one where you're like, I hope that is the case, but like it is generally not the case. And like it's a huge monkey wrench. What would be some of the things that people like assume that aren't true? Or what are like some of the things people like usually get wrong with how incentives actually work?
Yeah, well, I think it all comes down to, in part of what our job is and our kind of industry niche in the world is to cut out the perception and any bias that might be there or any kind of, what someone may think of a particular state or location or programs or even the business climate in, a particular jurisdiction. And is to really be able to cut through it. I think even in your home state of California, There are many that don't think there are incentives. There are programs that are out
We
there
just
to
push
help.
them out. We push people out. Yeah, that's just what we do.
But we are doing a lot of work, as you are, in the state, and there are incentives that are there to help, and to really help maintain and drive that investment in the state of California. They're developed in a way, to California and through the legislature and the governor's office, and then down to the local levels, to hit those core drivers that the state of California and the constituency wants to push for, but that they are there. And ultimately, as we look through, and as any good real estate brokers as well and partners, it's really being able to cut what is the true strategy of the business, the vision of the business, and then be able to bring the facts, and model the scenarios and across the board to help make that decision. And we are doing quite a bit of it today, where we're looking at that existing site or that existing portfolio, and does it work, and does it work the proper way? If there's a lease expiring coming up, that's an opportunity not just for a real estate decision, but for a business decision as well. And
Yep.
what are the true facts? A company is going to know their site better than anybody else. Are there labor challenges? Are
Yep.
there supply chain traffic issues, other things that come in line? Are there power risks to the power, the reliability, and what might be there, rising prices, rising costs in other different ways? And so looking at it and being able to take that, but then also provide the facts and the analytics behind it. And when it comes to incentives, is what is that true value, the opportunity to it? Also, what are some of those commitments that might come to capture those incentives as well?
I did some just cursory looking around of what some of them might be in a given county or city for this client that we have the opportunity to work on together, just to get a feel for like the flavor of what's possible. And it took all of 10 seconds for my eyes to glaze over, because it seemed like so much of them were not from the city or county, but that they were just facilitating, like making you aware of other programs that are not related to them. And they just give you like the menu and links and are like, here's 40 different things you can look at, and good luck. It was like, wow, okay. I already had a pretty good feel for a lot of the value that's added, but it seems like it's pretty opaque of like what is realistic and from who. And so I could only imagine like people trying to do that on themselves and having either a poor experience or just like not a high probability of having a great outcome.
Yeah, and as we talk about, we'll call that sometimes website incentives. And
Yep.
When companies or other partners and you review what's on the website, whether
There's a
that's a
term
page
for it. I love
or
it.
the community. Yeah,
Yeah.
so what they list, and there's a lot, and it all depends on what that entity is, the organization that's posting that information, and how detailed or not detailed they may put it in. And that's really one of our biggest roles is, and responsibilities in the process, is to identify what is possible out there. And what are some of those existing programs that are in place in a California perspective, and in that, with the California Competes tax credit program, there's the employment training panel, large training project on the utility side with different rate riders. But there's a number of other programs and policies out there, that can be potentially utilized and leveraged. And so for our job is to really understand what is the business, what is the asset type, what is the investment, the jobs, everything that's going to go forward, the scope overall of the project. And then how is that business structured? How is that business going to be structured into the future? And what of some of those programs that might be listed, others that aren't listed, or maybe somewhere else, or from other agencies, or even from the federal government. And, while we'll talk about, some of the big programs like the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act and others, but other programs that are out there, that perhaps doesn't run directly through the company, but perhaps even making sure that that county or that city, can also leverage some of those dollars to be able to utilize for things like infrastructure and job training and other programs as well. And then further from that is, as I mentioned before, some of the commitments that might be there to capture some of these different incentives or secure them, and as well as what the true value is. So when you look at, a great example is in California with the California Competes tax credit. It's a competitive program, can be incredibly influential for projects and keeping and has been successful in retaining and expanding investment, particularly in manufacturing and R&D and other areas in the state. But one of the challenges with it is it's considered a non-refundable tax credit. And so in order to utilize the incentive, you have to have tax liability in the state of California in order to do so. There are some opportunities to carry it forward, but that's another big area where, oftentimes if a company is doing it on their own, or, someone in a partner that isn't as experienced in the area, to be able to look at that and to be able to understand, and also, what is the process to get there? That particular program, again, is a competitive, it's a multiple application round and steps to get there. And so also understanding, what is it going to take to get there? What are the resources we need internally? And then after the fact, after we've gone through the process and through, all the different steps, is the post side as well. So ensuring that the business has the compliance and administration of those incentives in place to be able to do that. I mean, there are some stats as high as 73% of incentives that are awarded in the US are never actually received by companies. And a lot of that is not because the government entity or the regional economic development group, whatever it might be, doesn't follow through with what they're going to do, or that the company doesn't meet it. Oftentimes it might just be that those compliance mechanisms aren't in place. And it's not something to be overly fearful of. It's just literally having the resources, the bandwidth, tracking milestones. Everyone has turnover in their facilities, in their team, in their tax team, and operations, finance, whatever it might be. And so making sure that those, you have some of those mechanisms in place. And again, sometimes there can be onerous with the data requests and needs to be strategically done as far as the timing. But sometimes it could be just simply filling out 4 rows of a single spreadsheet and just getting that submitted on time and getting that in place. And so, certainly, again, an area to focus on if you are considering incentives is how you're going to navigate it as you go forward in order to ensure that you receive it and, again, minimize risk, because missing some of those could have risk back to the business as well.
Remember when I learned, why is there compliance? Why is there a need to stay around for a year, 2, 3, 4, or 5? And how these take time, and you have to hit certain performance metrics. And then there is an audit process, and this isn't just here's who we are and what we need, and we are worthy for this because we're going to spend X amount of dollars and hire X amount of people, and okay, here you go, and a deal, you've signed it, you've got the check, and everyone goes on and does their thing. Time goes on, and there's this whole other process that I think a lot of people are not aware of.
Yeah. And it's not it shouldn't be a detriment to pursuing incentives. One of the major, and we do some different surveying of CFOs and other C-suite and executives and corporate real estate executives of why not to pursue incentives, or why don't they consider them? And sometimes that is a reason, is because, well, the compliance and the risk afterwards. And it is more of something of understanding what it's going to take. And while you're going through that incentives process from the very beginning, is identifying what are, some of those commitments, what are some of those performance metrics that we're going to hit, and what are some of those milestones that are going to be required. And economic development partners and government officials and others, they want to work with you to get it through. But they have, sometimes it's strictly code that comes from the legislative branch of the assembly, or, the rule makers as they put it forward, and those need to be met. And so just, again, understanding what those are. They're not meant to be obstructive. They're not meant to be onerous, but just having that process in place and identifying, and where we come in and help on that, and been doing that for, over 30 years is being that extra resource when it's needed. Sometimes it's being an extension of the team, and, we'll be the one that reaches out to their HR internal partners or operations or real estate, whomever it might be, to get that investment, the canceled checks or the payroll data, whatever it might be, or just, internally, having a function. And, there's certain times a year when it is, when these reports are due, but to then, build out what are those, and even just a reminder, hey, here's a milestone that's coming up, a quarterly payroll report that needs to be submitted to accounting, for example. Again, it's not onerous, it's data that you have. But just getting ahead of it and planning and preparing for when that time comes.
You must be friends with a lot of accountants then, right? Who are the ones who are helping gather the data and have it available. And did they do it yet? Are we up to date? Do we have it when we need it?
Yep. But I'll tell you, there is, and our major hats off to our compliance team. We get more unsolicited thank you emails and notes from our clients to our compliance team than anyone else, because it is, where they come in and they save and rescue some of these, because again, there's turnover, maybe
Yeah.
they get, there's a new CFO that comes in and we had helped through the front end and they were taking on and there's turnover. They get a letter from the county saying, hey, you missed this, particular report. And then, call us right away, hey, and, come in. And, sometimes, we're talking millions of dollars, in credits and grants and other post-performance side, to be able to capture and credit. And so it's, it's just, again, it's a critical step to the overall process. It's not when the deal's done, you don't walk away. As we come in and there are some clients where, it's, oftentimes on a performance perspective, it could be 3 or 5 or property tax abatement sometimes might be, say, 10 years, but it could extend further. And we have clients that we extend and we will be supporting for 26 years, based on their abatement schedule. And so it's, it's exciting to be a part of it. And again, help them through that process because they've earned it. They hit those performance metrics. The state, the community has set aside, that money to go to it as part of their partnership and their co-investment into the project. And so it's just, making sure those different steps and that compliance is in place.
This topic came up talking about Cal Competes. For those who aren't aware of it, not only what is it, who is like the ideal candidate for being a good fit for that.
Yeah.
And I like that it's Cal Competes, that you have to compete to get it, and we're trying to be like a competitive for the other states. So that's a good one.
Yeah, so it is a competitive process. It is typically there's 3 application rounds. There's 3-week windows each fiscal year, and it comes in a form of tax credit. So the state will set aside a certain amount that they will put towards the program. And, typically in a growth scenario, so you're adding jobs, you're making investment, it's in an industry or a priority target for the state. And that can change, during for each fiscal year. And then there is an approval process. And so, you get through, there's multiple rounds to the steps through it. It's not automatic. There's no rubber stamp to it. But, ways that you can prepare for the application and understand what are some of those priority targets and, what we'll do is help work together with the business. And, is this something worth pursuing? The timing of the project, when is it going to go forward? And what are some of those commitments to make in order to...
I always think of it when you're moving, just because that's when the topic comes up, but that's not necessarily like only for companies that are in the middle of moving from one to another building. That's a sign of growth, but that's not the only growth that makes that an opportunity.
Yeah, and that's a very important and just thank you for making that point, because it is more and more of the investment as we're seeing all the incentives. It doesn't have to be a major move. It doesn't have to be a relocation. An expansion at an existing facility is certainly an opportunity and a trigger for many incentives across the country and around the world. Whether it's new jobs, it's new investment, it's you're increasing your power requirements and looking at utility incentives for that as well. And, in fact, we look at a lot of our project work today and pipelines, a lot of it is investment into the footprint. And, a lot of companies as they're looking at, where to go, where to grow, where their customer demand is, shifts in logistics strategies, raw materials, inbound, outbound. A lot of that is looking at, okay, well, we have, say, 4 facilities across the U.S. that create or manufacture this particular product line. Where does it make sense to make that investment? And of course, that is then becomes a competitive between some of those sites or between, the states that it might be in or the communities. And so looking at it from the incentives, and, while sometimes some of these incentives I mentioned earlier, they're written out of code or rulemaking that gets promulgated after the assembly hands it down, where it's a square peg in a round hole to make it work for an expansion. But more and more of these incentives, and when you work through it and understand that value, certainly where those opportunities can be there and be significant, to really help that investment. And again, from a economic developer perspective, as exciting as it is to, I think most mayors in this country have the hard hat and the big scissors ready in the office.
The
to cut
shovel.
that
Yes.
ribbon, that the shovel. I'm sure there's a shovel in one of the corners behind you somewhere, as well. But it is just as important, if not more, in today's environment for retention and to retain those jobs, to retain that investment, retain the tax revenues, for those businesses. And if you look across, I think one of the biggest trends in economic development is that BR&E, so that business retention and expansion strategy, and
Okay.
how can they support businesses to continue to expand? It's great to get new business, and new companies and industries and sectors, but also retaining, what you have today and utilizing some of the tools and resources like incentives to be able to help those companies not
Who's
only
not
grow and grow.
interested in retention? I mean,
Yeah, no,
yeah.
it is, and community by community, they're different priorities and, their prerogatives, which is the way it should be.
Yeah.
But right, so how they, can leverage the tools that they have to support those companies. And it's incredibly, to see how often companies don't utilize, those resources or don't even know they're there, when they're looking at some of these projects and some of these different investments that they make at their existing facilities.
Yeah. You mentioned utility incentives. I didn't even know that was on the menu. Yeah. What's that all about?
So utilities are, they want to also retain and as well as grow the businesses that they have within their territories. And, they have, it depends across the country, what different programs or what different tools those utilities might have. Certainly, most of them have something along energy efficiency side. So if you're investing in LED lighting in the facility, you're looking at, some of the new EV chargers or some
Get
of
some
the
solar
appliance
panels on that warehouse.
solar panels
Yeah.
on it, right? So yes, a lot of it from the energy efficiency, renewables, and incentivizing those types of programs, and in some states where there might be a renewable portfolio standard or a clean energy directive, to them to be able to hit those targets and those goals and to help their resident businesses with that. But they're also looking at a new charge and expanding in overall being a partner in economic development. And so as we see some of these utilities across the country, it's almost like the Tennessee Valley Authority, a TVA, or a Duke, or Florida Power and Light, and others that are really becoming more of that economic development team as well.
Duke was at like
Um,
an industry event, and I was like, I'm not
yeah,
quite sure I get why you're here and why you're like trying to woo people. And then I was like, okay, they got their own model going on here.
yeah. So they are also there, and they have teams, they have experienced professionals that are coming from economic development space, to help drive business and help again be part of that team, whether they're a bolt on to just help strengthen for especially for industrial clients and industrial users, but also bringing some of their tools to it. And when you look at California, so they have what's called a utility rate rider, that a lot of the utilities can utilize. They all have different allocations. Each utility will look at how they allocate, what some of those performance targets might be, the timing, the application process between a San Diego Gas and Electric and SoCal Edison and PG&E and others will, how they approach it. And it's important to understand, as you're looking at which territory they're in and how to navigate that process. And again, we can talk about some of the timing of when to do it. But a good back to the envelope for those is, say, a 12% reduction on your utility rates over a 5-year period. It's kind of a good, just quick back of the envelope for California, specific as you look at it. But in other parts of the country, and say in Tennessee Valley Authority in TVA territory, where they provide direct grants for jobs that doesn't necessarily tie specifically to the utility use, and to the rates, but even just recognizing that the growth and retention of the businesses within their territory and as partners, is only going to be better for their business, for their communities as they go forward. And utilities have different charges and kind of different missions across the country as well. And so how they come in and how they partner on these projects, and not to shift away from incentives per se, but utilities are also becoming a much more important and critical partner in the overall site selection process, especially when it comes to industrial users, because of the extended demand and this unprecedented demand for power, some of the challenges when it comes to capacity and generation. And so whether it's from that
Preach on,
capacity
David. Preach on.
and
Yeah.
yeah, and the, from the capacity side, from the demand side, the equipment, transmission equipment, and all of those where they become absolutely vital partners in ensuring in the near term, what is that phase one power requirement and going forward, but into the longer term as well, what that is. And data centers certainly get a lot of attention with that. And even some of
They're
the
hot right
nuclear,
now. I
yeah, the
feel like
nuclear
everybody's like,
conversation.
gosh, what can we do with this
Yeah. So,
land, this old office building, and like
yep.
that one, and cold storage are high on the
Yep.
list of like flyer ideas where there's a time and a place that it works for, but like a lot of people like go through it's like a 12-step program, and that is step 2 and 3 of like, what else could I do, and where is there money flowing in that like maybe there's a redevelopment opportunity.
Yeah, and it's incredible where the certainly one of the biggest trends is the utility, having the utility as a partner at the table in the process much sooner than they may have been historically, because of how important it is, to ensure the power, ensure the transmission, looking further on the water, the wastewater side, where they come in and how they participate in the project and in the ultimate deal in the end as well, to make sure that it happens. And so certainly encourage one of those is, there's when to bring them in, but to ensure that, you do when that time is right, throughout the process, and ensuring, that power is, we hear all too often, where these projects, the land, the site, the labor, everything looks great. You go to it and maybe even get options or control the land, and then go to the utility, and the utility is scratching their head because they just cannot provide that power to the site, or, it's going to be so long. I just heard it again a couple of days ago that, for some transmission equipment, it's taking, the expected time frame of delivery is 60 months. And so the thing I joke is that, does that sound better than 5 years? But realistically, right, these are some of those core factors that we have to look at. And then that doesn't even talk about, some of the local business and political and community climate, when it comes to power and land use as well. That is, certainly there's always been input, community input, critical to any project and long-term success and partnership. But maybe a bit louder today and more engaged than ever before.
Why would you be loud about that? I would think most of that is like a net gain. Is it the disruption from the construction of putting it in, like the infrastructure? What's the main rub?
Yeah, so different. It's a great question, and it varies across, certainly across states and across down to the very local, as local level as you can get, to NIMBY, to not in my backyard. I mean, literally the next door neighbor. But a lot of it when it comes
You can
to
NIMBY
power,
anything. Why not NIMBY
yes.
power? Yeah.
Yeah. So as part of that, it comes with, what that extended demand from it. And you look at what is that going to mean from our near and long-term capacity? And, one of the challenges when, say, from a data center perspective, and what we're, increasingly going to hear is part of it is they're not necessarily large job creators, as opposed to, say, a manufacturing facility. And so if you look at it, or you have different metrics of a job per acre, whatever that might be. And so, and you've had those arguments, and certainly in some communities that in California as well, where you don't have, you might not have as much land as you have in other parts of the country, or some of that land use where, is this the best use for that land? And those conversations have been going on forever. But now with the power side is we're running out of power, or at least in the near term and midterm, is this the best use for that power going forward, and utilizing it? And as we try to figure out into the future, and as, parts of this country and retiring fossil fuel plants, and, in other places where we're actually pulling down the power, and, some of the great opportunity of renewables, but also, some of the challenges that are there with it. And technology is rapidly progressing. It's an incredibly exciting time to see the innovation and what's going on. And just mention the micro nuclear conversations between the likes of Google's and Amazon's just this week, Microsoft as well, are unbelievable. But those
That's what it took to bring it back. But if that's what it took, maybe that's okay.
But but for some of it, it takes years to be able to get it online and in place. And so so just doing that, and not to take a political position either way, or some of the rhetoric there, but it's really making sure that within the strategy, within the location and real estate decisions, but especially the business decision, is making sure doing all of this due diligence on the front end, instead of finding these things out later, once you're there.
So you must have been aware of this chip plant north of Scottsdale and like what they had to do to get that set up and all the infrastructure. That's a big project.
It's incredibly exciting to see what has gone on across the country when it comes to semiconductors, and when it comes to the drive from the fabrications and that particular facility, the TSMC in North Phoenix, as well as Intel. And Intel, building a second fab in Chandler, and all the development and growth that's there. And they've been in this, we've had semiconductor, some call it the Silicon Desert, here in Phoenix for, a generation plus. And with TSMC, incredibly exciting, and the amount of jobs and 10,000 plus jobs that will come, and just for the site and the construction work and everything that's come in, but all the long-term growth that's come with it. But there are certainly a lot of challenges when it comes to some of that infrastructure, when it comes to the utility usage and the water and the wastewater and all that is going forward. Now, thankfully, again, technology and innovation and industrial users, especially of that size and capacity, understand that. And they don't want to come into a situation where, there's a scarce resource. And so ways that they can come through, there's a recent announcement of ASML and some of their investments on the wafer side in the valley here, and really the direction on the wastewater, and even on some of the data centers in Mesa here again that have turned more to a power requirement than a water requirement as they work to cool their facilities and their centers. Now, of course, that means instead of water, it's power as the challenge. And so, seeing what is, some of the proactive that Salt River Project utility is doing down here, with renewables and with battery storage and all that as well. But one of the very interesting things, and just something that we have to think about, can we talk about data centers and cold storage and others as power users? If the TSMC facility gets to 6 fabs plants, it will require over a gigawatt of power in its load, about 1.2 or so. The nuclear power plant, Palo Verde in the West Valley, is about 4 as where it runs. And so if you think about then that is the most powerful power producing nuclear power plant in the United States. So it would take about 30% of the power from that plant alone. Now, it's not just pulling from that plant, a lot of other sources coming online as they ramp that facility up. But just thinking about what that and the real swath and the unbelievable amount of power that it will take to get there. And a lot of they're doing internal and again, from a continuity and their own due diligence through the process. But that power plant is not just relied on for Arizona and Maricopa County. California, certainly you all, have some of that power and through the Rocky Mountain states and beyond. And so, but just to think about, how significant of a user that is, to be able to get there and drive it. But I recommend anyone that wants to see, manufacturing and ground up dirt and land and nerds out on it like we do, Justin, to see the cranes that are going in that facility and all over the valley, with some of these mega industrial projects going on. It is certainly an interesting and amazing site, and kudos to Arizona and the state and some of the state planning ahead, building highways like the 303 in advance, knowing that this investment is coming in the future, that
caused one of my clients to land an e-com facility over there.
It is incredible to see. And it's some of what the West, some of the Western states, the advantage that they have that, the East Coast or some Midwestern communities don't have, because the growth is already in there. They're locked, and, as growth built out, where, trying to get ahead of it. And so and getting ahead of that from infrastructure, but still, again, making sure and doing that due diligence throughout the process. And I'm sure as you did with your client, to land there in the West Valley.
And now's a worthy time to plug your report, David. You have a fantastic one that came out called Running Out of Power that's on your Hickey website, and one that went out last month that was about each state and some of the credits and incentives that are available. And for those listening, I found my first one from you and your group with the Inland Empire and labor. And I was like, whoa, what is this? And like, this is just what I needed for an assignment that I was working on. And it hit it from so many different angles that it was a fantastic way to get a better handle on why is that a good place and why does it attract businesses and what about that is attractive for businesses. And then you've been kind enough to share for some clients one of your Mexico reports. So I feel like you put out some great stuff there that is like above and beyond the call of duty. So I appreciate that you put those out there, and I think that's helpful for people to find your website and go through some of those.
Well, thank you, Justin. And as an accomplished author yourself, it's an honor to know that as you're reading and taking value from our reports and our thought leadership. And it's just been something over, our many years. We've been in business for just about 40 years, and, providing that thought leadership and getting that out there in different areas, and not just, to talk through real estate or site selection, but, again, reach out to some of the economic development community and others that, sometimes those conversations don't happen or overlap. And so trying to provide that in there. So our latest report that we just released, Running Out of Power, is really a conversation about a lot of what we just talked about. And what is the so what of what we're talking about, from transmission and demand and capacity. But then also,
I love it. What's the what? Yeah.
What are states and communities doing, and what are some of those solutions that they can provide in the near term, working alongside the utilities as well and other stakeholders. And then also what is kind of those actionable strategies, that roadmap that businesses need to be considering as well. And in their due diligence, as they're looking at new communities, sites, markets, and across the board, what are some of those ways to look as they go forward, but then also at their existing footprint, understanding what is that power use. You talk about some of the crazy things we hear sometimes from clients of, ensuring that they, truly on the power side. Certainly something we hear from our economic development partners and utilities, as well as the unbelievable requests that they get today. But, really making sure that those power or utility requirements and others are truly as they build up and as time and in the phase to what they need. And then, so you're saying it's available on our website. And then the report last month was really focused on incentives. And, it's one of those we've done for years. I think it was our 19th edition of our credits and incentives update, and really focusing on the U.S. and what's going on across incentives. And not necessarily like, hey, here are the big projects, here's what they got, but more towards, what do businesses, what do real estate partners, what do communities, what is going on across, what are those key trends, what do they need to be tracking across? And even some things, when we went from before COVID annually, probably about 60 billion US dollars that were put on incentives, the way we've been talking about incentives today, traditional.
60 billion.
60 billion. Today, that number is about 2 trillion.
Okay.
Now, a lot of that is COVID money. So that was built out first in a recovery, or, really emergency, into recovery, relief, and then into stimulus. And, as we're looking,
including the PPP funds, or no?
The PPP funds, the CARES Act, the American Rescue Plan, and the funding in it. Now, there's been newer programs since then that have been built out, like the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, which is billions of dollars in itself as well. Europe, other parts of the world have also responded, in especially when it comes to some of the chips and green and sustainability investments as well. More significant, again, from a perception perspective, far more significant than many, understand Europe to have in that case. But one of the things to be tracking, we talk about this in the report, is we're calling a fiscal cliff. So the American Rescue Plan Act, for example, provided $350 billion in state and locals, not to get too wonky here, but coronavirus recovery funds. And those funds were allocated by formula to states, to counties, cities, tribal nations, other entities, to be spent on recovery from the pandemic, but then also help build up in resiliency going forward. And so those programs could be used for economic development, infrastructure, workforce development, other uses. And we saw many of those communities and states leverage that. California was an example. I mentioned the California Competes tax credit earlier. they actually were able to take some of the federal dollars from that and have grant programs, because there are challenges with that incentive, and then it being a tax credit and having to have that liability. And so if there's a cash grant, it's certainly more companies could take advantage of it, and it's a different way to value and can be utilized by a business. And so Governor Newsom was able to leverage some of those dollars. Well, Florida is another example, and Governor DeSantis and one of their infrastructure, the Job Growth Grant Fund, also leveraging, probably $150 million in the end to help fund that program. Well, the challenge with that program now from that perspective is it needs to be used, and it runs out at the end of this year. And so most of that money has been utilized. So in those two examples, California and Florida are no longer available
That's the cliff part.
For budgetary reasons. So the grant no longer exists in the state, and some of the budget challenges now post all of this. And so important to recognize, because there are some, that $2 trillion figure won't stay there for long and forever. But just today, we talked about the CHIPS Act and Inflation Reduction Act, things that folks should be understanding and recognizing as more of that money continues to roll out and drives forward. And then really a full swath across all the states, local communities, the territories, tribal nations as well, of what some of those key trends are. And certainly, when we talk about compliance and we talk about return on investment, ensuring those are there, but also, some of the programs I earlier mentioned on expansion. And, something to consider is not all incentives need to have job creation. Jobs are, of course, a core KPI when it comes to how incentives are worked and how economic developers are kind of their metrics. But it doesn't always require that, because again, that investment into a facility, helps that overall retention and sustainability of that site. And so incentives that maybe jobs don't have to be a part of it, can't necessarily cut jobs, but not necessarily add jobs to be able to capture some of those incentives. So we talked through a number of those trends as well in the report, and that's also available on our website for download. And we also just did a webinar on that. And so that's available online, and we'll do we will do one for the Power Report as well. And we have some exciting reports to follow here yet this year as well.
The only thing you said more than partnership, David, was timing. And so being at the top of the hour would probably be the last question. But what you just mentioned made it seem like you almost need to check on this annually to know, is there something where we are at this moment in time that is relevant or applies? Or for me, I only see it when we're like at this inflection point where we're going to make some big decision on some big facility. And then, so it's always the right time at that moment to say, hey, we're thinking about making a big move, and how might this help this initiative and this project? So timing. What will you leave us with, how to think about timing?
Yeah, so I mean, the earlier the better in the process, as the business is going through their strategic decisions. And I know, Justin, you are a strategic partner when it comes to your clients, and, looking at all these factors, not just incentives, but labor and supply chain and power and all these others that we've mentioned that come into play for the business, real estate being one of those. And so looking at it as early as possible as you're strategic, especially as you're considering multiple states or sites or existing facilities even, is to make sure you are looking at it and evaluating it enough in advance that it can all be part of that decision process. And that
before you make your final decision.
Before you make your final decision, yes. And certainly
or before you make your move. Yeah.
Incentives are supposed to induce you to make a decision as well. So always consider, if you've made a decision, if you've created a job, you've made the investment, it's probably too late, or may compromise some incentives. Still might be worth the evaluation, because there are programs, there are, certain ones that can look back. But, we really highly encourage to always try to, get ahead of those final decisions, those lease signings, those major investments or putting equipment in place and other different elements. And we can certainly help advise on when that is and when that right time is to at least, again, start that evaluation of understanding what's possible and how that could impact that business decision going forward.
Love it. David, thank you for joining. I think that's a wrap for now, and I'm sure we'll have you on again sometime soon.
Justin, truly enjoyed it. Thank you again, and look forward to the next time.
Super. Have a good one.
Take care.
Yep. Bye-bye.